Mark here, and this is Crosslights, where we are re-examining the end times, episode 24, if you will. And we have been looking at Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, which is, of course, the famous chapter when Jesus talks about wars and rumors of wars and famines and earthquakes and all sorts of catastrophic things going on, and the Son of Man coming in the clouds of glory. And so we have, of course, raised the questions as to whether those things are future or whether, in fact, that they occurred in the past. And that's kind of what we're exploring here. And so as we kind of get toward the closing section now of the last portion of Matthew 24, we're going to be looking at something very important. We've been suggesting, of course, that these things were past events, and we're going to review some of that in this episode. But we're going to also be asking now, is there going to be a transition going from chapter 24 to chapter 25? And is this a transition, or is there continuity between the two? Because it's actually quite controversial. Some believe that Jesus will suddenly shift to a discussion on the end of the world, that he's no longer talking about the events that occurred in 70 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem and the war and all the things that we have been talking about. And so we're going to have to look at that and see if we can come up with some explanation. I'm going to suggest to you that there is no break in this narrative, that it is all one continuous narrative that deals with 70 AD. And so we'll try to navigate through that for you and with you. Hopefully this session might take a couple of sessions to get through that. But up to now, we've gotten now to the point where Jesus has mentioned all these things. And then he says in verse 32, Matthew 24:32, that from the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender, puts out leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see these things, you know that he is near the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. And then verse 37 says, for as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming, the parousia of the Son of Man. And in these 5 verses or so here, Jesus actually gives us 6 verses. Jesus gives us really 5 things. He gives us an illustration. He gives us an affirmation. He gives us assurance. He gives us a forewarning. And then finally he offers a simile, which is just a grammatical way of describing something. This is like that, okay? So in verse 32 and 33, we see this illustration. He says it's like a fig tree. The signs will be like the fig tree. When you see these things coming to pass, you'll know that the end is near. And so the fig tree has been commonly understood by many to be Israel, and in this case it is not Israel, it's the signs in total. And we talked a lot about last time about the fluidity of symbolism. It's not, you don't look at Bible symbolism, this always means that and only that. It's fluid. We looked at leaven, lion, morning star, even we could mention even today that Jesus refers to himself as a thief. He refers to the devil as a thief earlier in John. So these symbols all have meanings. These metaphors all have meanings, but they don't necessarily mean one thing and one thing alone. So when Luke helps us out in Luke 21 when he tells us that behold the fig tree and all the trees. And so we have the sign. It's not just a fig tree. It's when you see these conditions, you'll know. Okay. Secondly, he gives an affirmation by saying this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. He didn't say that generation, somewhere off in the future, who will see these signs. No, he's saying this is all in this generation. And I think we saw 4 pretty solid pillars of support for that. We looked at historical events. We saw that these things that Jesus talked about actually did occur in the first century, in the period between 30 AD, the death and resurrection of Jesus, and 70 AD when the temple and the city fell to the Romans. We looked at linguistic style and linguistic conventions and saw that this whole idea of Jesus coming on the clouds and glory was very much consistent language that we've seen in the prophets who spoke in the same manner about God coming in judgment, even though he was not seen visibly. There are many implications of that he was seen or was observed. And then, of course, there's always this idea of the relevant audience. Jesus is talking to, he's saying he's talking to this group of disciples and talking to them, and is explaining that these things are going to happen to you. And we learned about this transgenerational you earlier on, and how I explained to you that although that is something that does appear in the scriptures, especially we looked at it in Moses in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, that there's no evidence here that Jesus is speaking beyond his own generation. Moses actually said, not only am I speaking to you, but your future generations and your children. We have no such inference here from Jesus. He's talking to these men and saying these things are going to happen to you. And then finally we saw some of a literary context. We saw this, we've discussed in several occasions, this inclusio that begins in Matthew 23:36, where Jesus rebukes the Pharisees, tells them their economy is going to fall. He says these things will come upon this generation. And then we saw in chapter 24:34 here, we've seen that Jesus says the same thing, that this generation will not pass away. So that forms two kind of bookends which surround everything that Jesus is speaking of, okay? And so we call that in literature an inclusio. And then he provides an assurance. He says the heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And I'm going to suggest to you, we're going to look at that a little more closely here, but that he's not talking about the planet and the stars or the sun or the atmosphere or heaven. He's talking about the temple and the land, the covenant domain. And the reason we would suggest that is twofold. First of all, if we were to look at Isaiah chapter 51, if I may turn to that with you for a moment. In Isaiah chapter 51, get that for you. Probably should have had this ready for you, but I knew I was going to mention it. But chapter 51 of Isaiah, and if we look at verse 16 and 17, 16 is actually 15 and 16. Here we go, I've got it. He says, I'm the Lord your God, who stirs up the sea and its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. And actually he's referring to the nations that were arising against Jerusalem. But he says, I have put my words in your mouth and covered you in the shadow of my hand, establishing the heavens. The Hebrew word is the same word that is used in Genesis that the Lord planted a garden in Eden. He says that I have covered you with the shadow of my hand, that I might establish the heavens and lay the foundations of the earth. The word there is aretz, the foundations of the land, and saying to people, to Zion, you are my people. So we see the Lord establishing or planting the heaven. Jesus used a different form of that same verse by saying, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So there's this idea of planting the heavens, and that the heavens were planted. The idea of that planted heavens was the tabernacle and the temple complex, because God was establishing his presence or his habitation in a sin-infested world. Once man had fallen and he wiped out everything with a flood and did kind of a restart with Abraham and then ultimately with Moses. Very interesting. In Exodus, the book of Exodus, God establishes a place of rest, of his shalom in this sin-infested world. In Exodus 25 through 31, we get the instructions for the tabernacle. Interestingly enough, the Lord speaks 7 times, precisely as he did in Genesis 1 and 2 in the creation story. And in 25:1, he said the Lord spoke to Moses. In 30:11, the Lord spoke to Moses. In 30:17, the Lord spoke to Moses. 30:22, the Lord spoke to Moses. 30:34, the Lord spoke to Moses. 31:1, the Lord spoke to Moses. Now watch how this ends in Exodus 31, beginning in 12. He says, the Lord said to Moses, that's number 7, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctify you. So on the seventh speech, the seventh command to Moses, just like in the creation story, we get this whole creation narrative in the establishment of the tabernacle. We get it ends with God's rest. This is to be God's place of rest, and Israel was to rest as God actually just does this, or creates this new creation, a place of his rest, this tabernacle, which by extension goes to the temple, and that would be his place of rest in a sin-infested world. And the Jews understood the entrance to the table was like, or of the temple was like the gate of heaven. Okay, and Josephus speaks about this, the first century historian, Jewish historian, and we kind of touched on this last time, that the Jews saw that, they understood this as the design of the temple was such that it was like the Holy of Holies, inaccessible, the throne room, and then the outer courts, and then the rest of the temple. It all was a replica of the heavens. So the Jews understood this. The heavens and the land, not the earth. The land was the covenant domain. Okay, so we had the heavens and we had the land. Jesus is telling his disciples that although the heavens and the land, the temple and the covenant domain, are going to be destroyed, my words will not pass away. Okay, and this is what he's trying to communicate to them. And interestingly enough, we saw in this this whole context of the chiasm which existed here in Matthew 24, that begins in verse 29 and ends in verse 35. We saw the decreation, the sign of the Son of Man, and then at the center of this is the ingathering. The sign of the fig tree was next, and then the decreation. So the decreation of 35 looks back at the decreation in verse 29 of the sun, the stars, and the moon, and everything collapsing and falling, this whole collapse of the power centers. Okay, so Jesus is using the same, what we call linguistic convention. He's not speaking about the planet and the sky. He's talking about the heavens and the land. Secondly, we should also notice that, which we'll see in the next the next verses here, that in the context, he says that the flood, that it will be like the flood of Noah, like in Noah's day, the flood that came. Well, it's very interesting that if Jesus is likening his coming like the days of Noah, well, Noah's flood resulted in the inhabitants only, not the physical world being destroyed. Okay? Jesus' return in the first century was to be like that. It wouldn't be a destruction of the physical planet, of the cosmos. It would be a destruction of the inhabitants of the covenant domain, which was the heavens and the land. You see, and I hope you can kind of get that your head around that, because this is all connected. This is the language here is all connected. Okay. And then the fourth thing we said was there was a forewarning, and Jesus is telling them in verse 36 that you don't know the hour, that nobody knows the day of the hour. It's the Father only. Now, Jesus did know the generation. He spoke very clearly. He said, this generation will not pass away. He didn't know the day or the hour, and he's going to be warning his disciples, and this is a very important theme in the rest of the discourse, right through to 25, that they don't know, and so they're to be ready and they're to be prepared. Okay, and so it introduces a core theme. Now, this whole idea of the Father only knowing, no man knows, can really become a cop-out verse where you try to explain these things. So, well, no one knows. Well, that's just a deflection, okay? Jesus clearly said, this generation won't pass away. Nobody knows the day or the hour. I don't know the day or the hour. The Son doesn't know, only the Father. But this I can tell you, the generation now living, he said to his disciples in that day, in 30 AD, the next 40 years, which is basically a biblical generation, it will happen in that time frame, okay? And you need to be ready because it may be earlier, it may be later, I don't know, all right? Now, the final thing that we point out is he gives us a simile. Now we get into the actual days of Noah, okay? In verse 37 we read, for as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming, or parousia, of the Son of Man. For in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came, swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two will be in the field, one will be taken, one left. Two will be grinding at a mill, one will be taken, another left. So we're still in this generation context, because in verse 37, he says, so will be the coming of the Son of Man as in the day of Noah, the parousia. And that language, so will be the coming of the Son of Man, is precisely the same as verse 27 when he says, as lightning shines from the west to the east, or to the east to the west, so shall be the coming of the Son of Man, the parousia. That word creates a link between this section of Matthew 24 and the earlier section. So what happens is now, what we're saying is that the things happening in that generation don't end at verse 34. Jesus is continuing on, and he's telling us that it will be like a flood. We learned that the flood of an army, flood usually represents an army in many cases. Page 168 of the book, my book, The Threshold of Exile, which much of what we're talking about here, the Threshold of Exile. On page 168, I'll deal with that a little bit on the whole idea of an army being represented as a flood. And he tells us that this is how the Son of Man will come, okay? In verse Matthew 22 and 7, he tells us that the king sent his armies and destroyed that city. And so the nature of that coming, the nature of that judgment comes in the form of not Jesus standing on the planet, but in fact that it's the presence of the Roman army coming to destroy the city. And even the language of verse 40-41 tells us that two will be grinding, one will be taken, one left, two will be two men in the field, and there's the one taken was taken for judgment. Okay, in the story of Noah and the flood, he tells us specifically that only Noah was left, okay, and his family. So the ones left are the righteous. There's also continues the metaphor, the language, or the imagery of war, as was brought out in the book we looked at last time, was that the one taken in a siege or an invasion, the enemy would often take the best and brightest and take them off, the strongest, and take them off to exile, to be slaves or whatever, so that the elderly, the weak might be left behind, but even the best and brightest would be carried off. So we have some more war type language there. Okay, now we move to 24. Verse 42 to 44, where he says, now you must stay awake, he's telling the disciples, for you do not know the day your Lord is coming, but know this, if the master of the house had known what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Now catch this. Jesus is telling his first century disciples to be ready for his coming. Now, if he's talking about the end of the world, what he's telling them then, well, we know this discourse took place 30 or 33 AD, depending on your view of chronology. 37, 38 to 40 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. Jesus is telling them they need to be ready because his coming could what? Possibly come before the fall of Jerusalem? That the end of the world could come before the fall of Jerusalem. You see the problem with trying to push these things out into the future? Jesus is warning his disciples that they are to be ready, and this is all tied to his coming in judgment upon Jerusalem. They must be alert, because the Lord's going to come in judgment at a time when they may not expect. Okay? And so now we continue on in chapter 24. And he tells us that the disciples are to be faithful in stewardship. There could be a delay, and there is a fate expected for the hypocrites. So verse 45, he says, "Who then is faithful and the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household?" Now, Jesus is talking to the leadership responsibilities of the disciples. Okay, he's saying the master has set the wise servant who his master has set over the household to give them their food at the proper time. Blessed is that servant whom his master will find doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he'll set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come in a day when he does not expect him, at an hour that he does not know, and will cut him in pieces with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, so we see that these 12 and whoever that they appoint, obviously as leaders, they are to be preparing the churches for what is to come. They are to be good stewards over God's word and over what Jesus is showing them about what's to come, and they are to give it to the churches so the churches can be ready, okay? God wanted communities that were prepared for this event, okay? Now, the question of delay, and I think we may have touched on this, but I want to get to it again. The master being delayed. Now, we see delay here. We see it again in Matthew 25 in a couple of places. The word delay or the long time, we'll look at it more. But we need to understand this idea of delay and the faithless behavior that ensues in light of that delay. That delay has to be understood in light of their expectations, okay? Delay, long time, these are relative terms. They're not absolute measures of time, okay? And so, for example, let me use an example I use in the book. If I have a good friend and we're strapping young age of 20 or 25 years old, and he says to me, "Hey, I'm going to take a trip to Europe for a while. I'm going to head out for a couple months, and I'll see you when I get back." And when he returns, I'm a 65-year-old grandfather. Well, that's a long time. Okay, I don't think anybody would doubt that's a long time. So this idea of long time does not mean that this delay of the coming of Jesus has to be 2,000 years. Okay, this is where the whole idea of what's called the parousia delay, where it was understood that yes, Jesus was planning to come in their lifetime, but for some unknown reason there was a delay. Okay, but in John 5 and 6, Jesus encounters the lame man at the pool, and he says, he already sees him. He's been there 38 years, and Jesus says, I know that he's been there for a long time. And he asks him, do you want to get well? In Luke 23 and verse 8, we find that Herod had wanted to see Jesus. He'd been waiting to see him a long time. Okay, well, that's nothing more than the lifetime of Jesus. Okay, so we have to understand these terms. We make assumptions, and it's just regrettable. I think I got a note here for you. Yeah, from page 174 in the book, I wrote, "It is regrettably presumptuous and theologically biased on our part to assume that the phrases describing the Lord's time away, such as delay, long time, must refer to several thousand years or more. The phrase a long time is not an absolute measure of time, neither is the delay." And we cite that those two texts in John 5, 5-6, and Luke 23 and verse 8. These expressions must be understood relative to the expectations of those who heard the word. Now remember, we went through this a little bit for you on an earlier session. The disciples, based on rabbinical teaching of the day, and this is brought out by Alfred Edersheim in his book, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, it's where he quotes, and I looked up relevant Jewish documentation that basically states they expected Messiah to arrive, do good works, then disappear for 45 to 90 days, and then return to defeat their enemies, Rome, who was understood to be Edom at that time. Now, all that means is the disciples grew up with this expectation. These were Jews. They had heard, the rabbinical teachings. They were familiar with these oral teachings that were passed down. This is what their expectation was. And so if their expectation was 45 to 90 days, then Jesus is telling them, well, wait a minute, guys, it might be more like 40 years rather than 40 days, you see. And so this has to be understood relative to the expectation, and they were to conduct themselves and be leaders and prepare the churches for what was to come, okay? And so that was their stewardship, all right? Now, he says that the unfaithful steward, the unfaithful may come, the unfaithful who is not behaving as he should in a manner worthy of the gospel, said that when he comes, he's going to cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now that is not hell, and we're going to get into this more in depth in the next chapter when we begin to discuss the whole issue of eternal torment. But you have to understand, number one, he says they're going to go with the hypocrites. Well, 16 times Jesus mentions in the Gospels, Jesus mentions the hypocrites. And almost exclusively, he's clearly talking about the scribes and the Pharisees, whom he really gives it to in Matthew 23 for their hypocrisy, all right? And this may allude to the Judaizers as well, because they were, the Pharisees and those who should have been leaders. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Judaizers, those who tried to keep the church under the law of Moses, but they were in fact not real certain about Jesus' coming back. Okay, they had a faulty view, and they did not believe the apostolic testimony. We'll look at that in a few minutes. And so this place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth may allude to they're being trapped in the siege. Okay, that they're being cut a place with the hypocrites. The Pharisees were among those who remained in the city of Jerusalem when it was enclosed, when it was sieged by Titus. The Sadducees were wiped out of history at that time. And so Jesus is saying, look, there are people that should know better, and if they don't obey the words, the warnings I'm giving you, they may find themselves in the city celebrating Passover with the rest of the Jews who don't believe my warnings, and one day, and the day will come when that's going to be shut in, because he had told them that they needed to leave and stay away from Jerusalem. So the whole idea here is, it's not this idea of weeping and gnashing of teeth is assumed to be hell. It's not. It's the mourning, it's the groaning, it's the bitterness of those who were enclosed and left in Jerusalem at that time in the Roman siege. Okay? And so we'll leave that there, and we'll get now we want to just transition for a minute into Matthew 25 and verse 1. Now here's important transition, because that word shows up again here in verse 1. Then, he says, right? Then shall the kingdom be. Then, again, is the word tote. And tote, as we examined, was used to convey something that is concurrent, not sequential. So when sometimes you hear the word then, you mean like, well, way off then at some other time. But that's not the word. The word tends to mean something that is concurrent. And so when Jesus says then here, what he's meaning is at that time. So 25:1 is a connecting verse to Matthew 24. We're still in that time of all of these events that Jesus has been talking about. It's not a new time. It's not a time that's afar off. Okay, he begins to talk about, he's going to give us parables. He's going to give us some very difficult words regarding eternal judgment. And I'm going to suggest to you this is all stuff that's taking place in the first century. Okay? So these parables that he begins to talk about, the virgins, the talents, he says in verse 21 or 25, chapter 25, verse 1 to 13, he begins with the parable of the virgins. And I think what we're going to do, looking at the amount of stuff that I still have to cover with you, I think we're going to break it off here, and we'll take the whole chapter 25 in our next session. And I think that would be much easier to cover rather than try to stuff any more down your throat. So I know this is, so many of you, is just so new, so different. But just take your time to absorb it, and I'll try to keep you fed with some understanding, and we'll try to take this a chunk at a time. May God richly bless you. Thank you for tuning in. Till next time.